Donald Trump is stirring controversy once again after suggesting undocumented immigrants carry a likelihood of committing heinous crimes based on genetic factors. The former president and current Republican nominee for the 2024 presidential race appeared on the Hugh Hewitt Show to talk about the first anniversary of the Hamas-led attack on Israel that ignited a brutal and ongoing genocide in which more than 41,000 Palestinians have died. Trump spoke on other foreign relations matters while mounting numerous insults against President Joe Biden and Trump's current opponent, Kamala Harris. On the topic of immigration, he went after the vice president, stating that she wants to feed people governmentally and go into a communist party type of a system. However, it's his subsequent remarks about undocumented immigrants that have triggered accusations that the former president is, once again, dabbling in scientific racism. How about allowing people to come through an open border, 13,000 of which were murderers? Many of them murdered far more than one person, and they're now happily living in the United States, Trump said. You know, now a murderer, I believe this, it's in their genes. And we've got a lot of bad genes in our country right now. They left, they had 425,000 people come into our country that shouldn't be here that are criminals. And you know one of the worst stats? 325,000 young children are missing. Let me guess, the immigrants coming from Europe don't have the bad genes, one ex-user wrote. The KKK thought the same about black people during Jim Crow and beyond, someone else added. According to the National Human Genome Institute, scientific racism is a historical pattern of ideologies that misuse science to promote false scientific beliefs in which dominant racial and ethnic groups are perceived as superior. Leading scientists in many industrialized nations in the 19th and early 20th centuries championed these ideologies, but by the mid-20th century, pseudo-scientific racist beliefs were widely disproven. Despite that, evidence shows that scientific racism persists in science and research. These discredited set of beliefs was strongly perpetuated against Black Americans during the Jim Crow era when the eugenics movement became widely popular. Scientists would urge white Americans to marry and reproduce solely among their race, labeling the genes of ethnic minorities as unfit to improve future generations. Former President Teddy Roosevelt was one major proponent of eugenics in the early 20th century. On Trump's most recent remarks about immigrants, his campaign spokesperson Caroline Leavitt told NBC News, he was clearly talking about murderers, not migrants. As for the 13,000 figure Trump used to underscore his point, he's referring to the 13,000 immigrants convicted of homicide and are not detained by Immigration and Customs Enforcement. However, 3 ICE officials told NBC that data doesn't include whether these individuals are incarcerated in state or local prisons. Other officials stated that this data goes back decades and that many of these individuals entered the U.S. before Biden's presidential tenure, including when Trump was in office. Trump's strong rhetoric on immigration dates back to when he first ran for president. He once said that Mexico isn't sending their best, and suggested that many migrants crossing the border were rapists and criminals. He fiercely advocated for radical border policies that included building a wall at the U.S.-Mexico border. At Minnesota rally in 2020, he invoked race science again and told a predominantly white crowd, "You have good genes. You know that, right? You have good genes. A lot of it is about the genes, isn't it, don't you believe? The racehorse theory. You think we're so different. You have good genes in Minnesota." The racehorse theory was and still is widely embraced by white supremacists to perpetuate the racial purity and eugenics idea that whiteness is the pinnacle of genetics. The KKK thought the same. Donald Trump hit with accusations of scientific racism after suggesting certain people will commit murder because it's in their genes. Posted by BY Yasmin F. Published on October 8, 2024. Comments.
Yes, it is indeed a tragic aspect of the eugenics movement that it has historically been linked to oppressive practices, including slavery and other forms of coercion. Eugenics ideologies often dehumanized individuals deemed unfit by advocating for forced sterilizations, institutionalization, and other forms of control over their lives. This mindset devalued certain groups based on race, disability, or socioeconomic status, leading to policies that stripped people of their rights and autonomy. In the context of slavery, eugenics provided a pseudo-scientific justification for the belief that certain races were inferior and therefore deserved to be enslaved or subjugated. This dehumanization made it easier for societies to rationalize and perpetuate systems of oppression. Overall, the intersection of eugenics with practices like slavery reflects a broader pattern of using pseudoscience to justify discrimination, inequality, and violence against marginalized groups. The legacy of these beliefs continues to impact discussions about race, genetics, and ethics today. Yes, the forced sterilization of Black women, particularly in the United States, has a deeply troubling history that is linked to eugenics and systemic racism. This practice often occurred under the guise of public health and social welfare, but was rooted in a desire to control the reproductive rights of marginalized groups. Key historical context. 1. Eugenics movement. The eugenics movement in the early 20th century targeted those considered unfit for reproduction, which often included individuals from marginalized racial and ethnic groups. This included many Black women who were often viewed as being unworthy of motherhood. 2. Coercive sterilizations. Many Black women, especially those in poverty or institutionalized settings, like mental health facilities or prisons, were subjected to coercive sterilizations. They were often misled about the procedure or not informed of its implications. Some women were pressured to agree to sterilization as a condition for receiving medical care or welfare benefits. 3. Historical context of slavery. The legacy of slavery included ongoing efforts to control the reproduction of Black women. During slavery, Black women were often forced to bear children to increase the enslaved population. After emancipation, this control continued through various means, including coerced sterilizations. 4. Legal and social frameworks. Various laws and social policies facilitated these practices, reflecting a broader societal belief in the need to control the reproduction of certain populations. The sterilization of Black women often went unchallenged, as it was seen as a means of improving society. Number 5. Continuing impact. The legacy of forced sterilizations has contributed to ongoing mistrust of the medical system within Black communities. It highlights the need for ethical standards in reproductive health and the importance of informed consent. Overall, the forced sterilization of Black women is a painful chapter in the history of reproductive rights and human rights abuses, illustrating the intersections of race, gender, and class in systemic oppression. Statements like those made by Donald Trump regarding immigrants and violence can be highly controversial and often reflect broader societal tensions around immigration. Such comments suggest a belief that certain traits, including tendencies toward violence, are biologically inherent to specific groups, which aligns with a form of thinking that has roots in eugenics and other discredited ideologies. Key points to consider. 1. Generalization and stereotyping. Claims that immigrants are inherently violent generalize a diverse group of people and can reinforce harmful stereotypes. Most research indicates that immigrants, as a whole, are less likely to commit crimes than native-born citizens. 2. Impact of language. Language used by public figures can significantly influence public perception and policy. Statements that depict immigrants negatively can fuel xenophobia, discrimination, and violence against immigrant communities. 3. Research findings. Studies have shown that crime rates among immigrant populations are generally lower than those of native-born populations. This challenges the narrative that associates immigrants with increased violence. 4. Socioeconomic factors. Violence and crime are often influenced by socioeconomic conditions rather than inherent traits. Issues such as poverty, lack of access to education, and systemic inequality can contribute to crime rates. 5. Political context. Such statements often arise in political contexts where immigration is a contentious issue, and they may be used to rally support among certain voter bases by appealing to fears and prejudices. Conclusion. It is crucial to approach claims about groups of people critically, relying on research and evidence rather than broad generalizations. Statements linking violence to immigration or inherent traits can perpetuate harmful myths and social divisions. Donald Trump is considered a racist is a matter of significant debate and interpretation, often influenced by individual perspectives on race, immigration, and political rhetoric. Here are some key points to consider. Evidence and context. 1. Rhetoric on immigrants. Trump's statements about immigrants, particularly from Latin America and predominantly Muslim countries, have drawn accusations of racism. Phrases such as referring to some Mexican immigrants as rapists and claiming that immigrants from certain countries are inherently violent have been widely criticized. 2. Support from white nationalist groups. Some of Trump's rhetoric has resonated with white nationalist and supremacist groups, leading critics to argue that his statements embolden racist ideologies. 3. Policies and actions. Critics point to his administration's policies, such as the travel ban on several predominantly Muslim countries and aggressive immigration enforcement measures, as evidence of a racially discriminatory agenda. 4. Defenses and counter-arguments. Trump and his supporters often argue that his statements are misinterpreted or taken out of context. They may claim that he is focusing on issues of crime and border security rather than race. 5. Public reaction. Public opinion is divided. Many view his comments and policies as racially charged, while others believe he is simply addressing issues related to immigration and law enforcement. Conclusion. Ultimately, whether one considers Trump racist often depends on their interpretation of his comments, policies, and the broader social and political context. Many critics label his rhetoric as racist due to its implications and the historical context of such language, while supporters may argue he is expressing legitimate concerns about immigration. This debate reflects deeper societal divides regarding race and immigration in the United States. Donald Trump has not explicitly stated that he believes in eugenics as a formal ideology. However, some of his statements and policies have raised concerns about their alignment with eugenic principles or the promotion of ideas reminiscent of eugenics. Here are a few points to consider. 1. Rhetoric on immigration. Trump has made controversial statements regarding immigrants, suggesting that some groups are inherently violent or desirable. Such rhetoric can echo eugenic ideologies that emphasize perceived racial or ethnic superiority. Number 2. Support for genetic research. In some contexts, Trump has expressed support for genetic research and technology, including initiatives related to health and disease prevention. While these efforts are not inherently eugenic, the ethical implications of genetic interventions can overlap with eugenics-related concerns. 3. Public statements. His comments about public health, particularly regarding the COVID-19 pandemic, have at times included discussions about the fitness or worthiness of individuals and populations, which some critics interpret as having eugenic undertones. Number 4. Lack of formal advocacy. While some of his statements may raise alarm about eugenics or similar ideologies, Trump has not formally advocated for eugenics as a policy or movement. In summary, while Trump has made statements that could be interpreted as aligning with eugenic principles, he has not explicitly endorsed eugenics. The debate around his rhetoric often reflects broader concerns about racism, discrimination, and public health, rather than a clear ideological commitment to eugenics. Planned Parenthood, as an organization focused on reproductive health and rights, has a complex historical relationship with eugenics. Here are some key points to understand this context. Historical context. 1. Founding and early views. Planned Parenthood was founded in the early 20th century, a time when eugenics was gaining popularity in the United States. Some of the organization's early leaders, including Margaret Sanger, advocated for birth control as a means of improving public health and family planning, which intersected with the eugenics movement. 2. Sanger's views. Margaret Sanger, a key figure in the founding of the birth control movement, expressed views that reflected the eugenic ideologies of her time. She believed in the importance of controlling reproduction to improve societal health, and some of her writings advocated for limiting the reproduction of individuals she deemed unfit. This has led to criticism that Planned Parenthood has eugenic roots. 3. Evolving mission. Over the decades, Planned Parenthood's focus has shifted more toward providing comprehensive reproductive health care, including contraception, abortion services, and sexual education. The organization now emphasizes women's rights and autonomy over their reproductive choices. 4. Criticism and misinterpretation. Critics of Planned Parenthood often point to its historical ties to eugenics to argue against its mission, particularly regarding abortion services. However, supporters argue that the organization's current focus is on reproductive rights and health equity rather than eugenics. 5. Reproductive justice. Many advocates for reproductive rights view the movement as part of a broader struggle for social justice, aiming to empower individuals to make informed choices about their bodies, rather than a continuation of eugenic ideologies. Conclusion. While Planned Parenthood has historical connections to the eugenics movement, its contemporary mission is focused on reproductive health, rights, and education. The organization's legacy is complicated, reflecting the changing attitudes toward reproduction, race, and gender over time. It is important to engage with this history critically, while also considering the current work and advocacy efforts of Planned Parenthood in promoting reproductive rights. Yes, Margaret Sanger, the founder of what would become Planned Parenthood, was involved in the eugenics movement and attended eugenics meetings during her lifetime. Here are some important points regarding her association with eugenics. Involvement in eugenics. Advocacy for birth control. Sanger advocated for birth control as a means to promote women's health and freedom. Her views on reproductive rights were influenced by the eugenics movement, which was prominent in the early 20th century. 2. Eugenics meetings. Sanger attended various eugenics conferences and collaborated with prominent eugenicists of her time. She believed that access to contraception could help improve societal health by allowing individuals to make informed decisions about reproduction. 3. Public statements. In her writings, Sanger expressed views that reflected the eugenic ideology of the time. She argued for controlling reproduction to improve the fitness of the population and has been quoted discussing the importance of preventing unfit individuals from reproducing. 4. Criticism. Sanger's association with eugenics has drawn significant criticism, particularly in contemporary discussions about race and reproductive rights. Critics argue that her views and some of her statements promoted a racist and classist agenda. 5. Evolution of views. Over time, the focus of Sanger and the broader birth control movement evolved, shifting toward a more inclusive approach to reproductive health that emphasized women's autonomy and rights rather than eugenic ideologies. Conclusion. Margaret Sanger's involvement with eugenics is a complex and controversial aspect of her legacy. While her work helped lay the foundation for the reproductive rights movement, her historical ties to eugenics and certain views on race and reproduction have led to ongoing debates about her impact and the implications of her beliefs on current reproductive health policies.
Trump says migrants have brought bad genes into our country. The GOP candidate's latest racist anti-immigrant line of attack. Race science. Isabella Diaz. Reporter. It was only a matter of time before former President Donald Trump resorted to race science to further denigrate migrants, who he believes to be poisoning the blood of the United States. Speaking to radio host Hugh Hewitt on Monday morning, the former president, who once described himself as a gene believer and has a known obsession with genetics and bloodlines, accused migrants coming to the southern border of being criminals and having bad genes. When you look at the things that Vice President Kamala Harris proposes, they're so far off she has no clue, Trump said. How about allowing people to come to an open border, 13,000 of which were murderers? Many of them murdered far more than one person, and they're now happily living in the United States. You know, now a murderer, I believe this, it's in their genes. And we got a lot of bad genes in our country right now. They left. They had 425,000 people come into our country that shouldn't be here, that are criminals. Trump's claims are false. Of course, this isn't the first time the GOP nominee has spread overtly racist and dangerous lies about immigrants. Immigrant hating has become his entire brand, and ending all forms of immigration his main fixation. But Trump's latest rant comes as a reminder of one of his lifelong guiding beliefs, that some people are innately better than others. It also begs the question of what Trump might be willing to do to the people he believes to have bad genes. As my colleague David Korn wrote in this magazine in 2016, Trump has repeatedly claimed that success and money-making are contingent on genetics. During a campaign rally in Minnesota in 2020, Trump addressed a crowd of overwhelmingly white supporters in a county that had voted to reject refugee resettlements. "You have good genes, you know that, right?" On the occasion, he also explicitly referenced the discredited eugenics, racehorse theory, embraced by Nazis and white supremacists that selective breeding can produce genetic superiority. More than anything else, Trump penned in his The Art of the Deal, "I think deal-making is an ability you're born with. It's in the genes." In 1988, he told Oprah Winfrey, "You have to be born lucky in the sense that you have to have the right genes." Trump and his running mate J.D. Vance don't disguise their contempt for immigrants, especially those of color. When pressed, they double down on it. Recently, Trump injected into his immigration platform policy the notion of remigration, a proposal favored by the European far right to forcefully repatriate or mass deport non-ethnically European immigrants and their descendants, regardless of citizenship. They couldn't be any clearer about their ideals and desire to make America a homeland where, presumably, only those they consider to have the right genetic composition are welcome.
Anderson Cooper from CNN.
By now, most of the former president's thoughts on undocumented immigrants are well known, including that many are rapists, killers, and the like. Today, though, that kind of thinking crossed streams, as it were, with another of his well-known beliefs, namely in genetics and breeding. Here's what he told Hugh Hewitt today in the middle of talking about murderous migrants.
You know, now a murderer, I believe this, it's in their genes. And we got a lot of bad genes in our country right now.
He also said falsely that Vice President Harris was, quote, allowing people to come through an open border, 13,000 of which were murderers. That number, in fact, comes from figures which are not specifically about people who entered the country during the Biden-Harris administration. They cover any administration going back decades. In addition, that number includes cites people who are in jail or prison for their crimes currently or who have served their times for crimes. Back to genetics, though, it is, as we said, something of a pet subject of his. In this case, in 2020, invoking not murderous bad genes, but Minnesota nice ones.
You have good genes. A lot of it's about the genes, isn't it? Don't you believe? The racehorse theory, you think we're so different? You have good genes in Minnesota.
As you leave the page, don't forget to hit the like bell and subscribe to the channel. Thanks for watching.